Hey all, so we're in Virginia Civics and Economics now, Chapter 4, Section 1. If you have the following book, you can follow along with us today. So the SOL standards discussed in this are create and explain maps, diagrams, tables, charts, graphs, and spreadsheets, and describe the First Amendment's freedom of religion and speech. The vocabulary discussed in here are heritage, legislator, charter, and tyranny. So in this case, we're going to start with heritage. And heritage means the traditions passed down to us from generation to generation. So you can think of this in your context as students as sometimes your family has traditions that it does. And it might be passed down from your grandfather to your father and then to you. So going to church on Sunday could be considered a tradition. Maybe your family goes to church on Sunday and then always has a big Sunday meal with everybody around you coming to town, going to the meal. If you're always doing this, and if this came down, maybe from your father, and then you're going to do it, and then you want your kids to do it, you can think of that as a tradition passed down to us from generation to generation, or a heritage. Another heritage thing you can think of is that the values and experiences of the settlers from the 13 colonies make up our political heritage. And that's kind of what this whole chapter is about. We're talking about the very beginnings of government in this whole chapter and all the sections and movies related to it. And we're talking about simply how the beginnings shaped our now, how that heritage, how those experiences make up our heritage. A legislator means a group of people chosen to make laws, and the picture in front of you shows Congress, a group of people we have chosen to make laws for the entire nation of the United States. A charter is a document giving permission to create a government. You can think of this as, well, let's just say King of England going over to his friend William Penn there and saying, William Penn, I like you. I'm going to give you the right to make a government in Pennsylvania and to own that land and to make a government and to run it as you see fit. As long as you don't rebel against me, as long as you don't cause too much trouble for your neighbors, you have that land. And so basically that's what a charter is, a document giving permission to create a government. So tyranny means the abuse of power. So you might think some of your teachers are tyrannous or tyrannous, or practicing tyranny because you might think that they give you way too much homework and they're abusing their power over you because they destroy your lives with too much homework. So this story starts with the very beginning settlers of Virginia. And this is a start of why Americans today now always feel like they have a voice in government. Because at the very beginning we did. The very beginning of Virginia, what it was like is that if you owned a piece of land, you could say to, your buddy Dan, hey, I like what you want to do with this government, Dan, and I know you have land and have a say in who to vote for. I want to vote for you. I want to bring you to a place called Virginia House of Burgesses so that you can make laws for our state, Virginia. And what's important here is that sort of this idea of a voice in the government began very early for Americans, and it continues today. And the second thing that's important here is that this right only happened for people who had land, for people who were relatively wealthy. And you see that in this picture from the Virginia House of Burgesses. These guys look cool. They look like they have wealth, they have means, they have food, they have clothing. But even though this idea that we had a say in our government was with us from the very beginning, it doesn't mean that we weren't subject to what England said. And England did have final authority over the colonies. And this idea was that in every colony in Virginia, England established it through a charter, a right of basically England saying, I give you guys this land and you can make government as long as you do the following things. And what's also important here is that any colony might be stripped of their charter. For example, if they started to sink ships from England, And so the colony would then become a royal colony at that point when they were stripped of their charter, and England would be like, we're appointing our man to control what you do. So they would appoint a royal governor, which was their man, to control what you do. And in practice, what this meant is that, either royal governors were appointed to their posts from the very beginning, or royal governors were appointed because the charter for the colony was taken away from them. And those royal governors represented England's interests. They often had control of a lot of troops and soldiers that were in the colony at that moment, but they didn't have full and complete control. And an example of this is Virginia House of Burgesses standing up to these royal governors by saying, "Governor, we will not let you tax our citizens without our consent." And often this would go by unchecked by England. England had no desire necessarily to fight with the colonies because it was already fighting other major wars at this time. It was fighting the French and Napoleon. It was fighting the French and Indians that you learned about in 7th grade. It had a lot of different battles that was going on, and it didn't really police this too much. So often, the legislators of the colonies could challenge England and win. So citizenship in the colonies. How you might think of it different from today is that only white men who owned a certain amount of land could vote and hold office, like I said before. And this meant that African Americans as slaves were denied vote and considered property. But the other thing that I think is critical to note and describing the citizenship in the colonies and why America kind of looks like today is that America started as one of the sets of colonies England had, where they had the most rights of other citizens in the world. So these colonists often had more rights than other English colonies. These colonists in America often were more educated than colonists in other English colonies. Because of that, we brought over many of the traditions of England, and many of the traditions of England form our government today. But also because of that, we have more of a thought that we can control our own destiny. We have a voice in our government, as I talked about before. So there's also, at this point, roots of two of the rights we value today. And as I said, remember, we're emphasizing that connection between those events in the past and how those traditions, that heritage forms our government today. So we have two stories that sort of show religious freedom and show freedom of speech. We're going to talk about religious freedom first. The main characters were Roger Williams and a group of people called the Puritans. The places they resided in were Massachusetts Bay Colony and Rhode Island. So in this graph, this first circle is Rhode Island. The second two circles form Massachusetts Bay Colony. So religious freedom. The plot of this story is that Puritans ran away from England. This group called the Puritans ran away from England because England was like, we hate your religion. We don't like it, and we're going to put you in jail or have fines or do bad stuff to you because you believe the way you do. And so even though they were denied the ability to practice their beliefs well in England, when they came to America, they did the exact same thing to their own people, to anybody who disagreed with them. Because they were called Puritans for a reason. They believed that their version of Christianity ought to be so pure that there was no room for dissent. It was so orthodox that you couldn't have some ambiguity in there anywhere. That's, for example, that what's a modern day example? For example, that doing drugs was bad, and it will always be bad, no matter if it would save your life, or no matter if there's actually good parts to it. So the climax of the story is that this Puritan hatred for people who disagreed with them, who disagreed with their church leaders, forced this guy Roger Williams to leave the Massachusetts Bay Colony because he disagreed with the Puritan church leaders. He was a Puritan, but he was like, I don't agree with, that thing that you're saying just now. And so I think we should change it to this way. And so what he did was Roger Williams founded his own colony, Rhode Island, which promised that no colonist would be punished for any differences in opinion on religion. First example of religious freedom in our society, actually one of the first. There were many more. And that's a picture of Roger Williams right there. So this is the SOL term. This is a part of the First Amendment. The First Amendment guarantees us the freedom of religion. Government may not establish an official religion, endorse an official religion, or unduly interfere with the free exercise of religion. So this is an example of a story that happened, a tradition that happened in the past, how it affects us today. So now we have a story of the freedom of the press, and the main characters were a guy named John Peter Zenger and Andrew Hamilton, not Alexander, Andrew. The location of this was in New York. This is a picture of what New York State looks like today. So in this plot, Zenger accused the royal governor of New York of abusing his power by accepting bribes and interfering with elections. And the governor in turn accused Zenger of trying to stir up rebellion against the government. And remember, this was important because you could be stripped of your charter, of your rights as self-legislating bodies back then if you were, rebelling against the government and causing havoc for the King of England. And so what ended up happening is Zenger was represented by Andrew Hamilton, who argued that Zenger was innocent if what he said was true. If he said true things about the governor, then he wasn't stirring up rebellion against the government, but he was just telling the truth, doing his job as a newspaper. The climax of this was Zenger was eventually not found guilty. He was released from jail and went back to publishing his paper. And this inspired people back then and now to continue to fight for the freedom of press. And press is, think about it as just your newspaper. So the First Amendment and how the story relates to us today is that the First Amendment guarantees us the right to freedom of press. And this right is the press has the right to gather and publish information, including that which criticizes the government. So to conclude, as we near sort of the 1750s, we see signs of discontent, of sadness, of anger amongst the colonies against their mother country, England. This was the start of when royal governors actually cared more about what was happening in the colonies and tried to use their power more. And the colonists accused these royal governors of being tyrannous, of controlling and trying to dictate their lives unreasonably. Just like you might accuse your teacher of being tyrannous because they give too much homework. So these colonists wondered when England would eventually, down the road, strip them of all their rights and silence their voice. And remember, in part, England ignored the colonies for a good long while because they were fighting a bunch of other wars and doing a bunch of other things elsewhere. But once all those wars stopped, they needed something to do. And they saw that, hey, we got American colonies right there. Let's, actually think about them. And they did, and these royal governors using their power more and more and more and more and more is in part of that.